Alright, y'all, here's your roundup. So, now that the final season of Friendship is Magic is officially over, let's take a look at what the first half of the season gave us. Episodes 1 and 2. There's this thing that's been missing from the last few 2-part episodes in Friendship is Magic. 3-letter word, starts with F, a yellow sponge sang a song about it. Yeah, that's what it was. Personally speaking, my favorite season premieres of MLP are Return of Harmony and Princess Twilight Sparkle, because despite the high stakes, they're relatively simple stories at the end of the day, and they just have fun with the journey towards stopping the threat to Equestria. The Season 1 premiere did this as well, but that also had the job of establishing the world and the characters. This simple yet exciting vibe is what I get from the beginning of the end. MLP always makes me chuckle regularly, but this episode got genuine, hard laughs out of me. And I was never laughing at it, I was laughing with it, because the episode doesn't just focus on action, but interaction. The writers don't just throw a conflict at the characters to solve, they capitalize on their personalities to make the journey as fun as possible. And for the first time, the villains get this treatment too when interacting with each other. And I'll elaborate on this further when we get to Frenemies, as this point applies to that episode as well. I know some people were mad about how Sombra was so handily dealt with, but come on, people. I get that the last couple of villains have tricked you into thinking that the show's villains are meant to be defeated with dignity, but let's not pretend that we're above villains being defeated in comedic ways, especially when those episodes are fan favorites to this day. Chrysalis's invasion failed because she was dumb enough to put 2 strong magic users in the same prison, and people have still deluded themselves into thinking that she was always a master strategist. Not every conclusion needs to be epic. Episode 3. Wait, the Young Six are getting focus early in the season? Is everything okay over at Hasbro? It was definitely a good call to have this episode focused on the Young Six. While their bond with the Tree of Harmony had a poor beginning due to the lack of focus these kids had, there is something, much like the tree itself, that can be salvaged moving forward. While there are beats reminiscent of Castle Sweet Castle, Uprooted still manages to stand on its own. Castle Sweet Castle was more about one person grieving the loss of their home, while her friends, who don't have as deep of a connection to said home, impose their ideas onto her. Uprooted, however, involves 6 characters that all have an equal connection to the thing they lost, and they have to come together to figure out the best way to memorialize it despite their disparate tastes. Because of this, we get the interactions and personality development that we should have gotten last season. So what's gonna make or break this episode for you is whether or not you believe the phrase better late than never applies to this episode. In this case, I'm willing to apply it here. Episode 4. The 200th episode of the series. Those of you that were following me back in my early days will remember that I wasn't very fond of episode 100, because it was more concerned with blowing the fandom's collective phallus instead of actually celebrating the show. Really, every episode that tried to be a shout out to the fandom ended up sucking, and one of them ended up being the worst episode of season 6. Sparkle 7 avoided that pitfall gracefully. Not just because it was a shout out to the voice actors instead of the fans, but because it was a story first and a milestone second. What do I mean by that? Well, let's put it this way. If I saw Slice of Life for the first time without knowing its story or that it was the 100th episode, I still would have been able to tell that this was meant to be some kind of recognition of the fandom due to the overabundance of memes and the unusual focus on the background ponies. Sparkle 7 feels like a regular MLP episode while still having that special signature on it with how the humor is written. It's something that can be enjoyed whether it's a milestone or not, and that's what makes a good milestone episode. Episode 5. There's really not much to say with this one. If you like episodes like It's About Time and Lesson 0 to a lesser extent since Twilight doesn't go completely cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs this time around, The Point of No Return will give you a similar experience while still being unique on its own due to the humor. Good jokes, solid lesson, Twilight learns to chill the fuck out without making a complete ass of herself, all elements of a solid Twilight episode. Episode 6. This was one of those episodes I was not looking forward to. I said before that Stranger Than Fanfiction was my worst episode of season 6, and Quibble Pants was the central reason for it, so forgive me if I'm not the most enthused at the prospect of him coming back, on top of the fact that he's trying to be a MILF hunter, as if any old schmuck could be one. But I've got to say that this episode genuinely impressed me. It's a message kids and adults can take different lessons from. Kids learn to be more accepting of the people their parents choose to date as long as that person loves them, and adults learn that if they're entering a relationship where their partner has a kid, they don't have to try so hard to force a connection and just let it happen naturally. Both lessons are about patience, just in different forms, and Quibble actually shows himself to be an admirable character here. See what happens when you stop trying to acknowledge the fandom and focus on writing a good story, Hasbro? You end up with episodes that are actually good and your characters are all the better for it. Episode 7. One of the things I liked most about Discordant Harmony was its lesson. You don't need to pretend to be someone that you're not in order to impress your friends. Obviously, that's not an excuse to avoid self-improvement or to avoid correcting things that are actively causing harm, but if your friends love you for who you are, there's no reason to change who you are. She's All Yak applies this lesson with the added element of cultural assimilation. Yona's status as a foreigner attending school abroad applies a whole different context to her desire to fit in with her peers. And I can imagine that there are students who study abroad and go through similar feelings. You want to feel like you belong, but at the same time you don't want to lose yourself in the process. Where is the line between adaptation and assimilation? Because Yona is young, she doesn't see that line. Or possibly, her desire to belong is too strong for her to care where the line is. This, in turn, puts her teachers in a somewhat difficult position. Because all they know is that Yona wants to learn the various traditions of the Fetlock Fet, they didn't realize that they were turning her into someone she was not. If, for example, she had one teacher show her everything, it would have been easier to pick up on. But because she learned different things from different teachers, they didn't have a full perspective, and they didn't realize what they had done until it was too late. And it was a great touch for them to accept responsibility for the part that they played and apologize. This is how you make a good episode involving the different cultures in Equestria. You have those differences tied back to how people interact with each other, because lessons about healthy interaction with others is the foundation that this show was built upon. And there's a lot to pick apart here regarding that theme and how this episode uses it. Easily a frontrunner for this season. Episode 8. Episodes like this are why I'm glad that I decided to cover the entire first half of the season in one go. Fleshing out my thoughts on the beginning of the end helped me to do the same for Frenemies and vice versa. And if I had done my usual Roundup format, they would have been written separately rather than in tandem. Usually, with one major exception. On the rare occasion when MLP villains collaborate, the interactions just serve to either explain their plans or just move things along so we can get to the next scene. But since this episode focuses on the villains and only the villains, they have to actually interact with each other in order for the story to be interesting. Frenemies honestly reminds me a lot of Dragonshy. This early season 1 episode was the first adventure-esque story the show had after the premiere, and after spending several episodes getting to know the main 6 a bit, Dragonshy put them all on a quest where we can see how these 6 individual personalities mix without having to do the job of setting up the world, as mentioned earlier. Frenemies takes that concept and applies it to the villains. One of my favorite parts of the Return of Queen Chrysalis comics was her banter with the CMC while she was holding them hostage. Moments like that are the little spices that make for not just good villains, but good characters. Chrysalis, T-Rex, and Cozy Glow are all characters we're familiar with to some degree, so all this episode has to do is give good interactions that make the most of their personalities, and it does just that. Take the main 6, divide them by 2, and dump on a bucket of shade, and you get this trio. And I love them. Episode 9. Last season, Smolar was pretty much the only Young Six member to have a major involvement in the story that didn't involve the Young Six as a group, thus objectively making her the Young Six character with the most development prior to this season, even if it wasn't much. This is part of what made Father Knows Beast enjoyable for me, and the same can be said for Sweet and Smoky. Unlike Father Knows Beast, Sweet and Smoky has even more to bring to the table by taking us back to the Dragonlands for a story with Garble. One criticism I've heard floating around is that the revelation that Garble was actually a sensitive soul wasn't believable. But honestly, I find it very believable. Teenagers and even young adults are often made to feel like they have to hide their true passions if they don't align with the status quo, and sometimes that leads to them taking on a persona that's unlike who they truly are. High School Musical had an entire musical number about it, for God's sakes. Does that excuse his treatment of Spike? Of course not. But he puts in more work to earn forgiveness than Naysay ever did, among others. Episode 10. It's aight. The only real weakness here is that if you don't give a shit about the Apple family, you're just gonna be bored. I'm sure there are some people that didn't like how bitchy Applejack was in the first 2 acts despite having a history of being bitchy, if not bitch adjacent. I honestly wish that she had stayed that way the whole way through and have the episode end with Apple Bloom being right and rubbing AJ's nose in it. I like seeing my favorite characters get knocked down a peg every now and then. As it is, the episode's harmless. Plus Pear Butter's in it and she's fine as hell, so fuck off. Episode 11. It doesn't surprise me in the slightest that the first bad episode this season was a Starlight episode. But, interestingly enough, Starlight herself actually isn't the reason why this episode is bad. The episode comes off as though the writers had an idea for an episode about Starlight overworking herself and an episode about Silverstream being missing. But in order to keep the episode count to 26, the writers crammed these two ideas into one episode, to the detriment of both. The journey to find Silverstream was legitimately entertaining, but having it be resolved by her being in the first place Starlight should have looked made the whole thing pointless, especially when it could have been easily solved by Silverstream letting her teachers and family know where she was. The plot about Starlight being overworked was poor because the story had to contrive reasons for her to be overworked in the first place, like having the main six leave her by herself with all those students. Side note, they really need to stop doing that. And having Starlight never set office hours. That's like one of the first things you learn about a school counselor, what their office hours are. This maybe would have been excusable if the school had just started, but not this late in the game. While the episode ends with Starlight realizing that she can't always be there for her students, all the guilt tripping prior to that soured the moment. I'm not sure if this has ever occurred to Hasbro, but maybe guilt tripping a school worker whose occupation is known for being damn near impossible because of the high student to staff ratio isn't a good idea. Both of these conflicts have pants-pissingly easy solutions, and if a conflict is that easy to solve, you need to write a better conflict. There were clear signs of a better conflict in the first act. Most of the issues we see from the students were trivial at best, so the episode could have been about the young six constantly asking Starlight for help with problems on the level of Yona having issues with her braids, to the point where they contact her even after her office is closed, making it a lesson about respecting the time of your counselors and the needs of your schoolmates. That way, you can still have your commentary about counselors being overworked, without said overworking being caused by administrator negligence and the lack of something as basic as office hours. You didn't have to make the episode bad for Starlight, Hasbro. She's perfectly capable of doing that by herself. Episode 12. It's interesting looking back on how I viewed the CMC over the years. At first, they were among my least favorite characters because their tunnel vision goal of getting cutie marks meant that almost every single episode that they were in for the first 3 seasons revolved around that. Then, once season 4 hit, they were the highlights of that season for me because the writers began to show that there was more to them than just that single goal. Then by season 6, they began to fall into a hit or miss status and remained that way for the rest of the series. And while it's better than how they started out, it's still a bit disappointing. With The Last Crusade, my expectations were about the same as any other post-season 5 CMC episode. Average. I was also a bit wary because I didn't want this to be like The Perfect Pair, where a character's parents are introduced just for the sake of satisfying headcanons and forgetting to give those parents personalities outside of the fact that they love each other. Thankfully, The Last Crusade actually impressed me with what it managed to do. As Scootaloo's parents prepare to move to Sri Lanka and take Scootaloo with them, they're very apathetic to her feelings on the matter, assuming that because they're her parents, they know what's best for her. While this apathy is unintentional, the episode makes it very clear that regardless of intent, Scootaloo is still hurt by it, and that's what matters. The final scene of the episode is the crown jewel, second only to Scootaloo's outburst at her parents towards the end of the second act. It manages to make use of all the previous CMC episodes, even the bad ones, so even their less than stellar outings manage to contribute to an episode that's actually good. And they didn't leave out the fact that these girls are more than just their occupations as crusaders. Even when they aren't doing their jobs or working toward their goal, they still played a role in helping others outside of that, and Scootaloo's parents are able to understand what they did wrong. This is what makes The Last Crusade better than the previous parent episodes. It doesn't guilt trip the child characters into apologizing for something that was clearly the parents' fault. It doesn't do the bare minimum with their personalities for the sake of placating fans. It presents a story that makes the most out of their relationship with their kid. And to be completely honest, this episode was way better off towards the end of the season rather than the middle, because this would have been perfect as the final CMC episode. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have another mayor to add to the flank files.
What about Lofty and Holiday?
I don't know if they're into guys, but I'm sure the female MILF hunters would love a shot at them. Episode 13. It's fitting that the first and last episode of this season's first half gave us something indulgent and fun. Back when I used to review the comics, the Friends Forever issues were among my favorites, and this was mainly because most of them were comedy-centric stories that prioritized having a good time. While the main series story arcs were story-driven, Friends Forever was character driven, much like Between Dark and Dawn, and it makes sense for Celestia and Luna to have the preferences they show in this episode. Celestia's daytime duties are rather monotonous, so naturally she craves spontaneity. Luna has busy patrol shifts, so she wants to relax. The only low points in this episode for me were the scenes with the main six, who somehow thought that asking for help was a bad thing. We've already had other, better episodes that cover this topic, so tacking it onto this episode felt rather unneeded. At the very least, I can be grateful that these scenes were brief and spread out, so they aren't too much of a low point, but they're a low point nonetheless.
What's that crying sound?
Oh, that's just the lore nerds complaining that Celestia and Luna weren't portrayed more seriously. So, that's one half of Season 9 down, and so far, it's pretty good. I'm still considering the possibility that the second half will tank, much like Season 8, but I prefer to be optimistic. Let's see what the next roundup will start with. Oh, god damn it. So what did you think of this roundup? Swarm that comment section below or bug me on social media. Until next time, keep it sketchy, folks.